Château Montclair dozed in the morning mist of the late 12th century, like an old cat that had forgotten why it woke up. France of that time was a country where even the stones seemed weary from constant wars, tournaments, and the general necessity of looking perpetually medieval. In the northern tower of the castle, in a chamber that possessed all the advantages of modern living except for modernity, awakened Sir Bertrand de Montfort. He was a knight in that particular period of career when all the dragons had been either slain or had moved to more fashionable kingdoms, leaving him with an abundance of martial skills and a curious shortage of things that urgently needed smiting. Sir Bertrand lay in his narrow bed, which was exactly as comfortable as one might expect a bed to be when comfort was considered a character flaw, and contemplated the wooden ceiling beams with the intensity of a man trying to remember what day it was. The beams, for their part, contemplated him back with the patient indifference of wood that had been holding up roofs since before Sir Bertrand's grandfather had learned to hold a sword properly. "Gaston," he called, his voice carrying that particular quality of authority that comes from years of commanding men in battle and several weeks of commanding absolutely no one about anything more urgent than breakfast. From somewhere in the depths of the chamber came a rustling sound, followed by what might have been either a yawn or a small philosophical observation about the nature of early mornings. This was Gaston, Sir Bertrand's squire, servant, and occasional voice of reason, though the last role was one he approached with considerable reluctance, having learned that knights preferred their reason in very small, carefully measured doses. "Yes, my lord," came Gaston's voice, muffled by what sounded like several layers of blanket and the general unwillingness to participate in consciousness before the sun had made a more convincing argument for its existence. "What day is it?" There was a pause, during which Gaston presumably consulted whatever internal calendar mechanism servants possessed for keeping track of such things. "Thursday, my lord. The feast day of Saint Expeditus, patron of urgent matters." "How ironically appropriate," murmured Sir Bertrand, sitting up and immediately regretting it as his feet encountered the stone floor, which had spent the night perfecting its impression of winter in the mountains. "And what urgent matters await us on this blessed day of Saint Expeditus?" Another pause, longer this time, filled with the kind of silence that suggested careful consideration of how to phrase uncomfortable truths. "Well, my lord, there's the matter of your chainmail, which has developed what I believe the armorers call character, though they may mean rust. And your sword requires sharpening, having grown somewhat philosophical in its approach to cutting things. Also, Rocinante has been giving me looks." "What sort of looks?" "The sort that suggest he has opinions about the quality of hay we've been providing, and furthermore, that he is considering expressing these opinions in ways that may involve his hooves and my person." Sir Bertrand smiled. Rocinante was his destrier, a horse of considerable intelligence and even more considerable attitude. He had been named after a literary horse that didn't exist yet, owing to Sir Bertrand's peculiar habit of reading books that wouldn't be written for several centuries, a skill he had acquired from a mysterious traveling scholar who claimed to be researching temporal narrative dynamics and had paid for his room and board with stories that seemed remarkably prophetic. "Perhaps," said Sir Bertrand, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and immediately pulling them back as the stone floor renewed its acquaintance with his feet, "we should attend to these urgent matters of rust, sharpening, and equine diplomacy." "Indeed, my lord, though I should mention that the matter of your hose requires immediate attention." "My hose?" "The question of laces, my lord. You have been putting off this decision for 3 days now." "Ah yes, the great hose crisis of Thursday morning." Sir Bertrand had acquired 2 pairs of woolen leg coverings, one with laces for a more secure fit, one without for ease of removal. The choice between them had somehow evolved from a simple matter of daily dress into a profound philosophical dilemma about the nature of convenience versus security, freedom versus restraint, and whether a knight on vacation should prioritize practical comfort or maintaining the disciplined habits that served him in battle. "The laced ones suggest readiness," he mused aloud, "as if I might at any moment need to leap into action. The unlaced ones suggest relaxation, as if I have accepted that today holds no adventures requiring swift movement." "Yes, my lord," said Gaston, who had learned to recognize when his master was approaching one of his philosophical moods and was preparing to take cover accordingly. But what if the very act of choosing readiness creates the conditions that require it? And conversely, what if choosing relaxation ensures that nothing interesting happens? A profound question, my lord, said Gaston diplomatically, while privately thinking that the saint of urgent matters might want to consider expanding his portfolio to include urgent decisions about leg wear. Sir Bertrand rose finally, accepting the stone floor's cold greeting as one of life's small, unavoidable unpleasantries. He moved to the narrow window, where the morning light was beginning to make a more persuasive case for the existence of day. Below, the castle courtyard was stirring to life with the gentle inefficiency of a place where nothing particularly urgent was expected to happen. A kitchen maid crossed the yard carrying a basket of something that might have been vegetables or possibly rocks. The morning light made it difficult to tell the difference. A stable boy emerged from the horse quarters with the cautious gait of someone who had recently negotiated with creatures much larger and more opinionated than himself. Somewhere, a blacksmith was beginning his daily conversation with hot metal, the rhythmic sound of hammer on anvil providing a steady heartbeat for the castle's unhurried awakening. "Gaston," said Sir Bertrand, watching this peaceful scene and feeling the peculiar melancholy that comes to warriors when there's nothing immediate to fight, "what do you suppose other knights do when they're not actively knighting?" "I believe, my lord, that they practice their knighting skills so as to remain prepared for future opportunities to knight." "And if there are no future opportunities?" "Then I suppose, my lord, they practice anyway, in case they're wrong about the opportunities." This struck Sir Bertrand as either profoundly wise or profoundly pointless, and he suspected that the difference between the two might be smaller than generally supposed. He turned from the window and began the complex process of transforming himself from man in nightshirt to knight prepared for whatever the day might theoretically demand, while simultaneously trying to decide whether such preparation was an act of optimism or futility. And in that moment, with the morning light growing stronger and the sounds of castle life growing more confident, Sir Bertrand discovered that vacation for a knight was not the absence of battles to fight, but rather the presence of entirely new kinds of battles, smaller ones, perhaps, but no less requiring strategy, courage, and the occasional consultation with saints who specialized in urgent matters. The decision about the hose was eventually resolved through the ancient knightly principle of closing one's eyes and grabbing whatever came to hand first. This resulted in the laced variety, which Sir Bertrand chose to interpret as a sign from Providence that the day might indeed hold adventures requiring secure leg coverings, though what form these adventures might take remained diplomatically vague. Dressed now in his everyday tunic, a garment that managed to suggest both casual comfort and the vague possibility of sudden martial readiness, Sir Bertrand descended the narrow stone stairs to the castle's main hall. The stairs, worn smooth by centuries of feet belonging to people who had their own urgent matters to attend to, created a subtle percussion as his leather boots made contact with each step. It was, he reflected, the sound of a castle in no particular hurry to get anywhere. The great hall greeted him with that particular atmosphere of a room designed for feasting, celebrating, and conducting the important business of being impressively medieval, but which was currently occupied only by a few servants going about their morning tasks with the unhurried efficiency of people who had mastered the art of looking busy without actually rushing. "My lord," said Gaston, appearing with the supernatural timing that good servants cultivate, carrying a wooden tray bearing what appeared to be breakfast, attempting to look more appetizing than it actually was. "Cook sends her compliments and this morning's attempt at porridge, which she describes as character building." Sir Bertrand examined the bowl's contents, which seemed to be engaged in their own philosophical debate about whether they were food or simply an advanced form of mortar that happened to be warm. "Character building," he mused, taking a cautious spoonful. "I suspect my character has been sufficiently built by previous encounters with Cook's morning efforts. Perhaps today it could simply maintain its current level of construction." "I shall convey your diplomatic response, my lord. Though I should mention that Cook has been experimenting with what she calls creative seasoning." "Dare I ask?" "She has discovered that certain herbs, when added to porridge, create what she terms interesting textures." Sir Bertrand paused in his consumption of the allegedly nutritious substance and fixed Gaston with the look of a man who had faced armed enemies on horseback but was not entirely certain he was prepared for creative porridge. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should proceed to the armory. Physical activity may improve my appetite for interesting textures." The castle's armory occupied a chamber that had been designed by someone who understood that storing the tools of warfare required both practical accessibility and a certain reverent atmosphere. Weapons and armor hung from wooden pegs and iron hooks with the orderly precision of a place where everything had its purpose and most things occasionally fulfilled it. Sir Bertrand's personal suit of chainmail hung from a wooden frame like a metal ghost waiting patiently for resurrection. In the morning light filtering through the narrow window, it was possible to see that the mail had indeed developed what could charitably be called character, small brown spots that suggested the iron rings had been conducting their own experiments with oxidation during the peaceful weeks of non-use. "Behold," said Sir Bertrand, gesturing toward his armor with the dramatic flair of a knight who had spent considerable time practicing dramatic gestures, "the inevitable result of peace. My protection rusts while I eat porridge of questionable ancestry." "One might argue, my lord," said Gaston, producing a selection of cleaning cloths and what appeared to be a small pot of oil from the depths of his seemingly infinite capacity for producing useful items, "that this represents an opportunity for meditation through maintenance." "Meditation?" "The rhythmic nature of polishing, my lord. The careful attention to detail required to restore each ring to its proper luster. The satisfaction of transforming the neglected into the gleaming." Sir Bertrand considered this perspective while lifting a section of the chainmail and examining it more closely. Each ring was a small masterpiece of medieval engineering, iron wire formed into a circle, interlocked with its neighbors in a pattern that had protected warriors since someone first discovered that metal rings were more effective than hoping enemies would aim poorly. "There is," he admitted, beginning to work oil into the first rusty section, "something philosophically appropriate about this. The knight maintains his tools as the tools maintain the knight." "Indeed, my lord. And it provides an excellent opportunity to consider the nature of preparedness versus the reality of necessity." They worked in companionable silence for a time, the oil gradually restoring the mail's original dark gleam ring by ring. It was, Sir Bertrand discovered, oddly satisfying work, each clean section representing a small victory over entropy, a tiny assertion that order and readiness could be maintained even in the absence of immediate purpose. "Gaston," he said, pausing to examine his progress, "do you ever wonder what would happen if we simply stopped maintaining all this martial equipment? If we let the swords grow dull and the armor rust and simply became something else?" "What manner of something else, my lord?" "I don't know. Farmers, perhaps. Or merchants. Or scholars who study the migration patterns of geese." Gaston continued his careful work on a particularly stubborn section of rust while considering this hypothetical transformation. "I suspect, my lord, that you would find farming considerably more complex than it appears from the perspective of someone who has never had to convince wheat to grow in proper rows. And merchants, from what I understand, face battles every day. They simply conduct them with numbers and negotiations rather than swords and horses." "And the scholars studying geese?" "I imagine, my lord, that geese are rather like enemy cavalry, unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and inclined to make considerable noise while conducting their business." This comparison struck Sir Bertrand as so apt that he paused in his polishing to appreciate it fully. The idea of scholarly fieldwork as a form of warfare conducted with quills and observation rather than lance and sword had a certain philosophical elegance. "So you suggest that all human endeavors are fundamentally martial in nature?" "I suggest, my lord, that the skills required for knighthood, discipline, patience, attention to detail, the ability to remain calm under pressure, are remarkably similar to the skills required for most other worthwhile pursuits." A sound from the courtyard below interrupted their philosophical equipment maintenance. Through the narrow window came the unmistakable voice of Rocinante conducting what appeared to be a vigorous discussion with someone about something that had clearly failed to meet his standards. "Ah," said Sir Bertrand, setting down his section of newly gleaming chainmail, "it appears our equine philosopher has begun his daily critique of castle management." Perhaps we should investigate before he delivers his opinions in a more physically demonstrative manner. Indeed, my lord. Rocinante's morning lectures on the proper care and feeding of superior horses have become quite comprehensive of late. They descended to the courtyard to find Rocinante engaged in what could only be described as a heated discussion with a stable boy who was clearly outmatched in both vocabulary and volume. The great destrier, black as midnight and twice as confident, stood with the magnificent bearing of a creature who knew himself to be the finest example of horseflesh in the kingdom and was prepared to defend this position against all comers. "Good morning, Rocinante," said Sir Bertrand with the careful courtesy one used when addressing creatures capable of expressing their displeasure through the strategic application of hooves. Rocinante turned his great head and fixed his master with a look that conveyed several volumes worth of observations about recent standards of service, the declining quality of oats, and the general inadequacy of humans when it came to understanding the complex needs of superior horses. And in that look, Sir Bertrand recognized something familiar: the restless energy of a warrior without a war, a creature built for great deeds forced to content himself with small ones. The conversation with Rocinante proved to be both enlightening and diplomatically complex. It emerged, through a series of strategic snorts, meaningful head tosses, and what could only be described as equine raised eyebrows, that the great destrier had developed several strongly held opinions about recent developments in castle management. First, there was the matter of the oats, which had apparently declined in both quality and quantity since the halcyon days when there were actual battles to prepare for. Second, there was the question of exercise, which had devolved from the glorious challenges of cavalry charges and tournament melees to the mundane circuits of the castle courtyard, accompanied by stable boys who clearly failed to appreciate the artistic nuances of proper equestrian deportment. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was the philosophical crisis of purpose that arose when a warhorse of distinguished lineage found himself reduced to the role of very expensive lawn ornament. "I understand your concerns, old friend," said Sir Bertrand, running his hand along Rocinante's magnificent neck while carefully avoiding the areas where the horse had demonstrated his capacity for expressing displeasure through strategic nipping. "We are all, it seems, victims of our own success in creating peace." Rocinante responded with a sound that managed to convey both acknowledgement of this universal problem and a specific complaint about the current state of his stall, which apparently failed to meet the standards he had established during his more militarily active period. "Perhaps," suggested Gaston, who had learned to interpret the subtle nuances of horse-human diplomacy through years of mediating between knights and their mounts, "a training session would address several of these concerns simultaneously." "Training?" asked Sir Bertrand, though he suspected where this conversation was leading. "The practice yard, my lord. It has been some weeks since you and Rocinante have engaged in proper martial exercises. The quintan remains undefeated, the hay bales unmolested by sword practice, and the archery targets have grown quite smug in their safety." This was, Sir Bertrand realized, both an excellent practical suggestion and a diplomatic solution to Rocinante's mounting critique of civilian life. A proper training session would provide exercise for both knight and horse, purpose for equipment that had grown philosophical in its idleness, and the satisfaction of demonstrating martial skills even in the absence of enemies worthy of them. "Very well," he said, with the air of a commander making strategic decisions of great import. "Let us remind the practice yard that we remain capable of visiting violence upon it, should the need arise." The castle's practice yard occupied a section of the courtyard that had been specifically designed for the important business of preparing for warfare through the systematic abuse of inanimate objects. Straw-filled sacks hung from wooden posts like executed scarecrows, their burlap faces wearing the resigned expressions of entities that knew their purpose in life was to be struck repeatedly by people with swords. A quintan, the medieval equivalent of a punching bag with aspirations, stood in the center of the space, its rotating arm balanced with a sandbag that would swing around to strike any rider who failed to hit it properly and then ride past with sufficient speed. It was, Sir Bertrand reflected, a device that perfectly embodied the medieval approach to education: learn correctly or be immediately beaten by your training equipment. Archery targets lined one wall, their concentric circles faded from weather and neglect, looking like the eyes of creatures that had seen too much and expected little. A collection of wooden practice swords hung from a rack, their blunted edges speaking to the wisdom of learning combat techniques without the immediate risk of accidentally removing one's own appendages. "Where shall we begin, my lord?" asked Gaston, who had taken on the role of training master with the enthusiasm of someone who got to watch other people exhaust themselves while he provided helpful commentary from a safe distance. Sir Bertrand surveyed the practice yard with the calculating gaze of a general planning an assault, though in this case the enemy consisted entirely of objects that could not fight back and had never done anything to deserve the violence they were about to receive. "The sword work, I think," he said, selecting a practice blade from the rack and testing its balance with a few experimental swings. "It has been too long since I reminded these hay bales of their proper place in the hierarchy of creation." The first hay bale stood approximately 6 feet in height and possessed the general proportions of a man, though admittedly a man who had been stuffed with straw and had never learned to dodge. Sir Bertrand approached it with the focused intensity of a knight preparing to engage a worthy opponent, despite the fact that the bale's most threatening characteristic was its tendency to shed straw when struck. "Remember, my lord," called Gaston from his position of strategic safety, "the key to effective sword work is the combination of power and precision. Think of the blade as an extension of your arm, your will made manifest in steel." "Easy enough to say," muttered Sir Bertrand, "when one's opponent is incapable of extending his will in return." He began with the basic cuts, overhead strikes that split the morning air with satisfying whooshes before connecting with the hay bale in explosions of scattered straw. Each impact sent a small cloud of vegetable matter into the air, creating the sort of golden atmospheric effects that would have been quite poetic if they weren't accompanied by the decidedly unpoetic sounds of a grown man grunting with effort as he systematically dismantled a bundle of dried grass. "Excellent form, my lord," called Gaston, though perhaps with slightly less enthusiasm. "The goal is controlled aggression, not the complete annihilation of agricultural products." Rocinante, watching from his position near the stable, offered his own commentary through a series of snorts that seemed to suggest professional approval mixed with mild amusement at the spectacle of humans working so hard to defeat enemies that posed no actual threat. Sir Bertrand paused in his assault on the increasingly bedraggled hay bale and wiped perspiration from his forehead. It was remarkable, he reflected, how quickly one could work up a sweat when fighting opponents that couldn't fight back. There was something almost embarrassing about the amount of effort required to maintain combat readiness when the only combat available involved agricultural products. "The lateral cuts now, my lord," suggested Gaston, "and perhaps we might progress to the more advanced techniques. The feints, the parries, the complex combinations that separate the true knight from the mere hay bale botherer?" "Quite right," agreed Sir Bertrand, though he couldn't help noticing that his supposedly defeated opponent continued to stand upright despite having absorbed what would have been several fatal wounds had it possessed anything resembling vital organs. "Let us demonstrate that we remain capable of the subtle arts as well as the straightforward ones." He began a more complex sequence, cuts combined with steps, advances, and retreats, the elaborate dance of combat performed solo against a partner who offered neither resistance nor applause. It was, he realized, rather like being an actor performing a dramatic monologue for an audience of one very stoic scarecrow. And yet, there was something satisfying about the precise execution of techniques learned through years of training and combat. Each movement flowed into the next with the fluid precision of a skill so thoroughly mastered that it had become second nature. The sword moved as if it were indeed an extension of his arm, and for a few moments, the practice yard transformed from a place where knights entertained themselves by bullying farm equipment into a stage where the ancient arts of war were preserved and honored, even in the absence of actual wars. "Magnificent, my lord," called Gaston as Sir Bertrand completed a particularly complex sequence that left the hay bale looking thoroughly defeated despite its continued vertical status. "I believe you have successfully demonstrated your complete superiority over vegetable matter organized in roughly humanoid form." "And what," asked Sir Bertrand, breathing only slightly harder than when he had begun, "shall we say this victory teaches us?" "That some enemies, my lord, are defeated not by their destruction, but by our demonstration that we remain capable of destroying them should circumstances require it. This struck Sir Bertrand as either profound or ridiculous, and he suspected that the distinction might depend entirely on one's perspective regarding the philosophical implications of swordplay conducted against objects that had never posed a threat to begin with. Having successfully demonstrated his continued mastery over immobile agricultural products, Sir Bertrand turned his attention to the more complex challenge of mounted combat training. This required the cooperation of Rocinante, who had been observing the sword practice with the patient expression of a professional watching an amateur attempt to perform tasks that were, in his considered opinion, far more interesting when conducted from horseback at considerable speed. "Right then, old friend," said Sir Bertrand, approaching his destrier with the careful courtesy one used when requesting favors from creatures capable of expressing their opinions through the strategic application of 800 pounds of muscle and attitude. "Shall we remind the quintan of its proper place in the natural order?" Rocinante's response suggested that he found this proposal considerably more worthy of his attention than the recent hay bale harassment. He allowed himself to be saddled with the dignified cooperation of a monarch permitting his servants to dress him for a state occasion, though he did take the opportunity to express several nuanced opinions about the tightness of the girth strap and the angle at which the stirrups had been adjusted. The quintan stood in the center of the practice yard like a mechanical scarecrow with delusions of grandeur. Its rotating arm balanced a shield target on one side and a cloth-wrapped sandbag on the other, the entire apparatus designed on the principle that any knight who failed to strike true and ride past quickly would be immediately educated about the importance of precision through a vigorous blow to the back of the head. "The key, my lord," offered Gaston from his position of strategic consultation, "is to strike the shield cleanly and then encourage Rocinante to accelerate past the counterweight before it can complete its rotation and attempt to rearrange your understanding of physics." "Encouraging Rocinante to accelerate," observed Sir Bertrand as he mounted, "has never been among my more pressing concerns. The challenge is usually encouraging him to slow down once he decides we're engaged in proper knightly business." This proved to be prophetic. The moment Rocinante felt his rider settle into the saddle and take up the practice lance, the great destrier underwent a transformation from patient stable companion to engine of barely controlled martial enthusiasm. His entire bearing shifted, his neck arched, and his step acquired the precise, collected energy of a warhorse who had suddenly remembered why he had been bred and trained. "Steady," murmured Sir Bertrand, though he wasn't entirely certain whether he was addressing his mount or himself. "It's only practice. The quintan has never done anything to deserve the full fury of our combined martial prowess." Rocinante's ears flicked back in what might have been acknowledgement or might have been polite disagreement with this assessment of the quintan's guilt or innocence. They began at a collected canter, approaching the target with the controlled aggression of professionals conducting a routine demonstration. Sir Bertrand leveled the lance, sighted down its length toward the center of the shield, and squeezed his legs to signal Rocinante that precision was required. What happened next was either a testament to the enduring partnership between knight and destrier or a demonstration of what occurred when two military minds decided independently that half measures were for people who lacked commitment to excellence. Rocinante accelerated. Not the gradual increase in pace that Sir Bertrand had intended, but the explosive surge of power that had once carried them through the press of actual battles against enemies who possessed the discourtesy to fight back. The quintan, which had been approaching at a manageable speed, suddenly seemed to be rushing toward them with all the velocity of an oncoming siege engine. Sir Bertrand's lance struck the shield with an impact that rang across the practice yard like a bell announcing the end of the world. The quintan's arm spun with such violence that the sandbag counterweight achieved what could only be described as aeronautical ambitions, whistling through the air with the sort of speed usually reserved for projectiles launched by expensive siege equipment. Rocinante, for his part, demonstrated his complete understanding of the tactical situation by continuing his charge well past the now spinning quintan, executing a perfect combat turn at the far end of the yard, and returning to his starting position with the satisfied air of a professional who had just reminded everyone present why warhorses were considered valuable military assets. "Magnificent," called Gaston, though his voice carried the slightly strained quality of someone who had just witnessed an event that was simultaneously impressive and mildly terrifying. Though perhaps with slightly less enthusiasm, the quintan appears to be reconsidering its career choices. Indeed, the training device was still rotating with the sort of determined momentum usually associated with mill wheels or celestial bodies. The sandbag counterweight swung past at head height with a whooshing sound that suggested it would be happy to provide educational experiences to anyone foolish enough to approach before it achieved a more stable relationship with gravity. "I believe," said Sir Bertrand, watching the quintan's continued rotation with professional interest, "that we may have reminded it somewhat too vigorously of its place in the natural order." "Rocinante seems pleased with the results," observed Gaston. This was undeniably true. The great destrier stood with his head high and his ears pricked forward, displaying the unmistakable satisfaction of a creature who had just successfully demonstrated his continued relevance in a world that had grown disappointingly peaceful. There was something almost smug in his bearing, as if he were saying, "You see? This is what we're capable of when you stop asking us to be decorative and remember that we're instruments of war." "Perhaps," suggested Sir Bertrand, dismounting while the quintan continued its meditative spinning, "we should conclude today's martial exercises before we accidentally achieve something that requires explanation to people who weren't present to witness the context." "A wise decision, my lord. Though I believe we have successfully demonstrated that your vacation from active knighthood has not diminished your capacity for visiting violence upon training equipment." "Indeed. And Rocinante has reminded us all that retirement is a concept that applies primarily to humans who lack the good sense to be warhorses." As they led Rocinante back toward the stable, the quintan gradually slowed its rotation, eventually achieving a state of relative stability that suggested it might, in time, forgive them for the excessive enthusiasm of their demonstration. Behind them, the dismembered hay bale stood in mute testimony to the morning's other educational activities, its scattered straw creating small golden drifts that would provide puzzles for the stable boys and entertainment for the castle's chickens. "Gaston," said Sir Bertrand as they walked, "what do you suppose we should do with the remainder of this day, having successfully proven our continued mastery over inanimate opponents?" "Well, my lord, there remains the question of your sword, which still requires proper sharpening. And I believe Cook mentioned something about this evening's meal requiring what she termed nightly consultation regarding the proper preparation of what she described as a fowl of suspicious ancestry." Sir Bertrand considered this prospect with the same careful attention he had given to the morning's combat training. The idea of applying nightly expertise to culinary challenges struck him as either a natural extension of his martial skills or evidence that peacetime had driven him to seek adventure in increasingly unlikely places. "A fowl of suspicious ancestry," he mused. "This sounds like a quest worthy of our talents." And with that observation, they continued their unhurried progress toward whatever challenges the afternoon might present, secure in the knowledge that they remained capable of meeting them with appropriate levels of violence, diplomacy, or culinary consultation as circumstances required. The afternoon sun had achieved that particular angle that made everything in the castle look as if it were posing for an illuminated manuscript, when Sir Bertrand and Gaston found themselves summoned to the kitchen for what Cook had described as a matter requiring nightly judgment. This, in Sir Bertrand's experience, could mean anything from settling disputes about the proper seasoning of stew to determining whether certain vegetables had achieved sufficient submission to be considered properly conquered. The castle's kitchen occupied the sort of space that suggested its designers had understood that the preparation of food was both an art form and a form of controlled warfare conducted against ingredients that often displayed surprising resistance to being transformed into meals. Large wooden tables bore the scars of countless culinary battles, while an impressive collection of knives, pots, and mysterious implements hung from hooks and pegs like the weapons in a particularly domestic armory. Cook herself, a woman of formidable presence whose relationship with food could best be described as a benevolent dictatorship, stood before a wooden table upon which lay what had once been a bird, though its current state made its original species a matter of some speculation. "Sir Bertrand," she said, with the tone of someone presenting evidence in a case of considerable importance, I require your professional opinion regarding this creature." Sir Bertrand approached the table with the cautious attention of a knight examining potentially hostile terrain. The fowl in question was certainly dead, which eliminated any immediate threat, but there was something about its proportions that suggested it had lived a life of considerable ambiguity regarding its proper place in the established order of poultry. "What," he asked carefully, "am I looking at?" "That, my lord, is precisely the question. It arrived this morning from the village market, sold to our provisioner as a chicken of unusual size. However, upon closer examination, I have developed certain reservations about its alleged ancestry." Gaston leaned in for a closer inspection, his expression suggesting someone conducting a diplomatic reconnaissance mission in territory where the local customs were not entirely clear. "It's certainly large," he observed, "though the proportions seem rather ambitious for a chicken." "Indeed," said Cook. "The legs suggest a creature accustomed to considerable running, the breast indicates either excellent nutrition or possibly an entirely different species, and the neck." She gestured toward the appendage in question. "The neck suggests a bird that spent its life reaching for things that were substantially higher than the average chicken coop." Sir Bertrand circled the table slowly, applying the same analytical attention he had once devoted to assessing enemy positions and siege fortifications. The fowl lay in state like a feathered mystery wrapped in the enigma of its own questionable identity. "The feet," he said, pointing with the air of someone making a crucial observation, "are clearly designed for scratching and grasping. But the size suggests either a chicken of extraordinary individual achievement or possibly something that began life with different ambitions entirely." "My thoughts exactly, my lord. The question becomes, how does one properly prepare a fowl of uncertain lineage? Should it be roasted as befits a noble bird of substantial proportions? Stewed as appropriate for a creature of potentially tough constitution? Or perhaps prepared according to some entirely different tradition that acknowledges its mysterious heritage?" This was, Sir Bertrand realized, exactly the sort of problem that arose when peacetime forced knights to apply their strategic thinking to domestic challenges. The same analytical skills that had once been devoted to determining enemy weaknesses and planning military campaigns were now being brought to bear on the question of optimal cooking methods for poultry of questionable provenance. "Tell me," he said, "what does your experience suggest about the cooking characteristics of unusually large fowl?" "Large birds, my lord, often require longer cooking times to achieve proper tenderness, but they also risk becoming tough if subjected to inappropriate heat levels. The challenge is determining the correct balance of time, temperature, and preparation method." "And what options do we have available?" Cook gestured toward her collection of cooking implements with the pride of a commander displaying her arsenal. "Roasting, which would preserve the dignity of a noble bird but might prove inadequate for a creature of tough constitution. Braising, which would ensure tenderness but might be considered insufficient honor for a fowl of substantial proportions. Or we could employ the method I use for game birds, which acknowledges both the possibility of nobility and the reality of wild living." Sir Bertrand considered these options with the gravity of a military strategist weighing tactical alternatives. Around them, the kitchen hummed with the quiet activity of a domain where dinner was both a daily necessity and a recurring artistic challenge. "What would you do," he asked, "if this were not a fowl of mysterious ancestry, but rather an enemy fortress of uncertain defenses?" Cook's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone who had just been asked exactly the right question. "I would probe its weaknesses, my lord. Test its responses to different approaches. Apply pressure gradually and observe the results." "Excellent. Then let us conduct a strategic reconnaissance of our opponent's culinary characteristics." What followed was perhaps the most thorough military analysis ever applied to the preparation of questionable poultry. They examined the fowl's structure for weak points, tested the resistance of various portions to gentle pressure, and developed a comprehensive strategy that involved initial reconnaissance through careful seasoning, followed by a measured assault using controlled heat application. "The plan," announced Sir Bertrand, "is to begin with diplomatic overtures through gentle marinating, proceed to strategic pressure application through slow braising, and conclude with a final assault using elevated temperatures to achieve proper presentation." "A masterful strategy, my lord," agreed Cook, "though I might suggest the addition of what we could call allied support in the form of vegetables that will both complement the fowl's character and provide intelligence about its cooking progress." As the afternoon progressed, the kitchen became a command center for the most elaborate fowl preparation campaign in the castle's recent history. Sir Bertrand found himself consulting on questions of seasoning deployment, timing coordination, and the optimal positioning of root vegetables for maximum strategic advantage. "You know, Gaston," he said, watching Cook execute their carefully planned culinary assault with professional precision, "there's something remarkably satisfying about applying military principles to domestic challenges." "Indeed, my lord. Though I suspect Cook has been conducting successful campaigns against recalcitrant ingredients for years without requiring formal military terminology." "Perhaps. But there's something to be said for bringing one's professional expertise to bear on new problems. It suggests that the skills we've developed are more broadly applicable than we might have assumed." As evening approached, the mysterious fowl achieved what could only be described as total surrender, emerging from its prolonged siege tender, flavorful, and bearing no resemblance to any chicken anyone had ever encountered, but clearly having achieved its proper destiny as dinner rather than biological puzzle. "Victory," announced Cook, presenting the completed dish with the satisfaction of a general who had successfully concluded a challenging campaign. "Indeed," agreed Sir Bertrand, "though I suspect our opponent put up considerably less resistance than some we faced." "Different battles, my lord," observed Gaston, "but perhaps the same fundamental principles: careful planning, appropriate application of force, and the wisdom to know when to adjust one's strategy based on changing circumstances." And as they gathered around the great hall table to enjoy the fruits of their culinary campaign, Sir Bertrand reflected that vacation, for a night, was not the absence of challenges to overcome, but rather the opportunity to discover that the skills of leadership, strategy, and problem-solving could be applied to an endless variety of situations. From rusty chainmail to suspicious fowl to the eternal question of whether life was more interesting when one had clear enemies to fight or when one had to find meaning in the daily victories over smaller, more domestic forms of chaos. The fowl, whatever its original identity, proved to be excellent, and the evening settled around them with the satisfaction that comes from having successfully transformed mystery into understanding, challenge into accomplishment, and one very large bird of questionable ancestry into a thoroughly satisfactory conclusion to a day that had contained no battles but considerable opportunity for the application of martial virtues to peaceful purposes. Vint.